Welcome back. You're watching India Global with me, Gaurie, Dwivedi, shifting our focus to the African continent, which China has been eyeing for the last 1.5 decades in great detail. It's been pumping money. It's now doing so yet again this year as well. $51 billion is the funding that China has committed to the African continent. But how much of it is actual money? How much of it is that famous debt trap that China has been building, some would say has built already in pockets of the world, Djibouti being one, in Africa as well. And what lies ahead in terms of China-Africa ties, impact on the rest of the world, and of course on India as well, which has been trying to deepen its engagement with Africa. Okay, Andrew Lung, who's a China strategist, joins me on the broadcast, along with Godfrey Mutizwa, who is the editor of CNBC Africa. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for taking out the time. Godfrey, let me start with you. I was going through some of the numbers. You know, if you just take a look at the $51 billion divided between the different heads, credit line is $30 billion, $11 billion is a very vague various assistance category, and $10 billion is the investment. So when you say $30 billion of credit line, we know that Chinese loans don't come cheap, do they? So how is the African continent reading this? And how do you see this in terms of the money that continues from China? But the color of those checks make all the difference, don't they?
Indeed. And as you mentioned, the bulk of that money is certainly in credit lines. So I did a quick calculation. So 20% of that money is what will come in as investment. But you've got to look at it, I think, from an African perspective. You're talking about a continent that is hungry for capital, that's got a lot of needs. And so you will find perhaps not too many questions are being asked about how the money has been divided. But of course, even as we talk about that $51 billion, reminding you again that this is a far cry from the huge amounts of money that had been poured in before. $120 billion over a decade in the previous assistance period. So there's certainly a scaling down, but the money certainly continues to come in for a continent that might not be asking the right questions in many cases.
Absolutely. China has pumped in more. 2016 was its best year in terms of overseas investments. It scaled down because of how its economy has been doing back home as well. But, you know, when I saw the statement and the details of the summit, what stood out was 3 countries, Zambia, Ethiopia, Ghana, all saying that they want a debt relief. South Africa, where you are, also the president said that we want better terms and we want to change the dynamics of the trade. We don't want to keep sending raw materials and keep importing finished goods. So essentially, China, the trade relationship that China has right now with Africa is one-sided, and 10 years after this partnership, it isn't changing.
It remains one-sided. There's no question about that. And as you mentioned, the president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, making the point that he wants a more balanced trade relationship between China and South Africa in particular. In fact, the numbers are scary. When you go back to 2021, Xi Jinping promised that he was going to spend $300 billion buying African goods. We all know that that is not panned out for various reasons. Yeah, so the relationship is certainly skewed, but there's little in terms of strategy that we see that African countries will implement to try to balance that relationship. You speak about the other countries that have got issues, Zambia, Ghana, certainly on the debt side, and Zambia, as you know, defaulted on its debt to China. It's a continuing problem for the African continent without question, but there appears not to be any kind of overall strategy that will help the continent negotiate better with China. Each country appears to be going in on its own behalf, and this, of course, as we all know, is an unequal relationship.
Indeed. Andrew Lung, respond to that. Pandemic came, pandemic went. Countries pleaded China for some sort of a debt relief. They didn't get any. Even at this summit, there were countries, 4 of them, which said that some debt relief needs to be given. But all one talks about is loans and loans when it comes to China.
Well, before China became a big lender to Africa, let's not forget that Africa was the net recipient of a lot of free gifts from the West. In other words, just not only debt relief but straight line grants, and they did not help Africa's development.
How
Because,
much
as
debt
the
relief
saying
has
goes,
China given?
it's no use.
How much debt relief has
Well,
China given to Africa?
Well, as far as the debt situation is concerned, a recent study by a UK-based think tank called Debt Justice found that a lot of African countries, they are more indebted to Western commercial lenders in aggregate in comparison with the loans from China. But of course, that as the previous speaker was pointed out, Africa was in great need of not only capital but infrastructure. In other words, Africa is the world's last dynamic food basket. But most of the agricultural products, they're out of nowhere. I mean, how do you take the
Absolutely. I
produce
couldn't agree more that
market?
the African
So they need
continent needs
infrastructure, and
infrastructure,
infrastructure needs
world-class
money.
infrastructure. But the question, Godfrey, is should it be at the cost of sovereignty of these assets? So I want to ask you this, that the next phase of the Chinese-African relationship, do you see that now keeping these African interests in mind when they negotiate with China for additional loans, additional projects?
Well, indeed, this
Well,
is a
there
very,
appears
very
to
good
be
question, because
they appear certainly to be a little bit more vocal, yeah, if I may say. They appear to be a little bit more vocal in terms of what they want from China, that is the African countries. But I think what is missing is a broad overall strategy that helps them negotiate from a position of strength. Individual negotiations of the countries between themselves and China, I don't know. I don't know how, to what extent they would be able to yield the kind of results that would skew the debate and perhaps balance that relationship.
Indeed, absolutely. And Djibouti is an example of where that balance needs to be struck by governments as far as infrastructure needs and sovereignty concerns. Appreciate both of you for taking out the time to speak to me on NDTV World and shifting